Racing Through Time is the story of the drivers, the cars, the teams and the famous circuits that made motorsport history. In this episode, we look at the pre-war rise of German domination in motorsport. With huge engines, narrow tyres and few rules, the racing cars produced by Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union were fast and fearsome beasts, and the racing was frantic, spectacular and dangerous. Join us as we race through time. Early in June 1934, the new Mercedes-Benz W25 Grand Prix cars were weighed on the official scales at the Nürburgring prior to the Eifelrennen. Built to the newly introduced 750 kilogram formula, the W25s were a kilogram overweight. Legendary Mercedes team manager Alfred Neubauer came up with a solution: remove the car's white paint and go back to the bare aluminium. The cars were reweighed and silver was to become the racing colour of German racing cars. The German press in the 1930s called Mercedes and Auto Unions the Silver Arrows, which has led to a legendary reputation for engineering and technical excellence. The German motor industry has always been technically oriented, with attention given to imaginative design, solid and reliable construction, and exhaustive and comprehensive testing. The basis for this was motor racing. The heritage of the German motor industry is best seen in the Daimler-Benz Motor Museum at Stuttgart. It contains examples of nearly every one of the cars built by Gottlieb Daimler, Karl Benz and the companies which followed. The racing section is particularly evocative, with the trend-setting designs which won so many races, driven by the greatest racing drivers of their day. Christian Lautenschlager, Christian Wagner, Max Seiler, Manfred von Brautich, Rudolf Caracciola, Bernd Rosemeyer, Tazio Nuvolari, Hans Stuck Sr., Hermann Lang and Karl Kling. At the end of the 19th century, Germany was a powerful but not entirely stable empire. It was in this melting pot that the petrol-engined motor car evolved. Nicholas Otto first developed the design for the four-stroke engine. His ideas were then taken up by Gottlieb Daimler and Karl Benz, who built the first motor vehicles at this time. Daimler engines powered the Panhard Levasseur cars to many successes in the 1890s and helped the French motor industry to its early supremacy. In 1900, the Daimler company made a motor car which they christened Mercedes, after the daughter of Emil Jelinek, consul in Nice for the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. This new model was an instant success, and from this time, Daimler-Benz's racing models have been known as Mercedes. The stubborn and independent Gottlieb Daimler would not live to see the first specially built racing car, the brainchild of designer Wilhelm Maybach and Jelinek. His health declined and he died on March 6, 1900. The early 1900s saw the last days of the great city-to-city races. These events were finally halted due to their increasing accident rate. The German teams prepared for the successor, the Gordon Bennett Trophy. Founded by American publisher James Gordon Bennett, the races were organized by the Automobile Club de France. Teams of 3 cars represented each nation. The 1903 race was held in Ireland because the previous year a British Napier had won, and the winner hosted next year's event. Belgian driver Camille Janazzi, one of the most forceful and spectacular drivers of the day, won in a white 60-horsepower Mercedes. The Gordon Bennett races established the tradition of national colours in racing, and this success helped establish Mercedes' reputation. The Gordon Bennett Trophy races were discontinued in 1906. For the 1908 season, the French organised a Grand Prix on a 77-kilometre circuit at Dieppe. After a battle with Victor Hemery's Benz, Christian Lautenschlager came through to win in his Mercedes. For the Benz team, Hemery won the 1908 Indianapolis 500. And David Bruce Brown won the American Grand Prix in 1912. In the meantime, Paul Daimler had put to use the knowledge gained in 1913 with devastating effect. The 1914 French Grand Prix had a full team of 5 Mercedes, and they were all factory entries. Few Frenchmen were concerned about this threat to their Peugeots, the marvellous twin-cam 4-cylinder engine, which had been setting the standards for speed and road holding. For this race, they had another advanced feature: 4-wheel brakes. The cars had weighed 1,100 kilograms and the engine capacity was limited to 4.5 litres. In the Grand Prix, a race of more than 7 hours, the white Mercedes broke the speed and the spirit of the opposition by sheer persistence. They were given little or no chance of beating the Peugeots, yet they defeated 32 cars of a dozen different makes and finished 1, 2, 3, Lautenschlager, Wagner and Salzer, in the last great race before motor racing ceased prior to the First World War. One of these cars left for America with Ralph de Palma before the British blockade of Germany. He won the 1915 Indianapolis 500 with this car, the second victory by Mercedes in this famous event. From 1902 onwards, Daimler used the Mercedes name set inside an oval badge. Mercedes were now looking for a new badge design. Paul and Adolf Daimler came up with a design first drawn by their father, a 3-pointed star, and this was trademarked in 1909. Following the First World War, the first appearance by a Mercedes was in the 1921 Targa Florio. Max Seiler drove a Mercedes 2895, not one of the great Mercedes models, but a useful bridge across the years of conflict. Until 1924, German and Austrian entries were refused in the French Grand Prix. Daimler and Benz were in competition, but in 1924 they joined in a working agreement to coordinate design, production, buying and selling. 2 years later, in 1926, the companies amalgamated to form Daimler-Benz AG. The new trademark was the 3-pointed star inside a circle with a border enclosing the names Mercedes and Benz, which has come to stand for the spirit of pioneering and tradition. Using their experience of building aircraft engines during the war, Daimler were developing the first efficient supercharger system. This was used to improve their engine's power, range and efficiency. Ferdinand Porsche, an Austrian engineer destined to become the most famous designer of the 20th century, produced the 2-litre Mercedes. It won the 1924 Targa Florio. While Porsche was making his name, Max Wagner and his staff designed the rear-engined Tropfenwagen at Benz. 3 of the 2-litre Tropfenwagens were entered for the Grand Prix de Europe at Monza in 1923. Although outdistanced by the Fiats, they performed creditably, 2 cars finishing. The return to galloping inflation in the 1920s in Germany was to postpone the project. While the world was now beginning to forget that Mercedes and Benz had once been winners of prestige races, they were to be reminded in no uncertain terms of their capabilities by Ferdinand Porsche's next design. The K, S, SS, SSK and SSKL. The Daimler-Benz board had ordered a prestige touring car, and Porsche gave them a racer instead. These big, 6-cylinder, single-overhead camshaft supercharged touring cars were heavy but powerful. Porsche and the design staff brought the 3-pointed star proudly into the new decade, and they performed well in sprint events and reliability trials. Indeed, a man destined to become one of Germany's great Grand Prix drivers of the 1930s, Rudolf Caracciola, confirmed his talent in one of these cars. Due to restrictions imposed by the new Daimler-Benz board, the company didn't return to Grand Prix racing until 1934. For a sports-minded company such as Mercedes, it had to make do with existing cars. Porsche's design was continually improved and enlarged, and the Big Six became the flagship of the company's range. They won the German Grand Prix in 1926, driven by Otto Merz, and the German Grand Prix for sports cars the same year, driven by Caracciola. In 1929, Caracciola won the RAC Tourist Trophy at Ards, beating the Bentley team in the process. He won the Irish Grand Prix in 1930 and put up a valiant struggle at Le Mans against the winning Bentleys. 1931 was to see the most important victory for one of these cars when Caracciola, partnered by his riding mechanic Wilhelm Sebastian, drove his SSKL to victory in the classic 1,000-mile race around Italy, the Mille Miglia. He was the only German driver ever to win this event. In 1931, the great Caracciola also won the Eifelrennen and the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. In 1932-33, the active racing career of the SSKL drew to a close. On May the 22nd, 1932, at the Avus, it seemed unlikely that a German car and driver would repeat Caracciola's victory of the previous year. A new, streamlined SSKL was to be driven by Manfred von Brautisch, a member of the famous German military family. He'd given up his military career after a serious motorcycle accident, and the dashing bachelor had decided to become a racing driver instead. The race at the Avus soon became a battle between Caracciola's Alfa Romeo and von Brautisch's streamlined Mercedes. The two cars were evenly matched on the corners, but von Brautisch was able to use his car's greater power and better aerodynamics to pull away on the straight to win at an average of 190 kilometers an hour, a new record. The streamlined car reached a speed of 240 kilometers an hour on the main straight. Ferdinand Porsche resigned his post at Daimler-Benz after a stormy board meeting in October 1928. Leaving Stuttgart, he made room for his successor, Hans Niebel, and Porsche moved on to greater things. In 1932, Germany felt the full force of the Depression. Employment at Daimler-Benz was down by half, and millions of skilled workers were out of work in Germany. In mid-year, 4 motor firms, Audi, DKW, Horch and Wanderer, all engineering companies and vehicle manufacturers of known standing and ability, formed a new automobile combine called Auto Union. Each company represented by one of the 4 rings. In the midst of the Depression, a new Grand Prix formula was introduced to take effect in 1934 through to 1937. It set a maximum weight of 750 kilograms without tyres and liquids. Despite the traditional sources of funding for racing cars exhausted, that is, fuel and accessory companies, Daimler-Benz decided to return to racing in 1933. It did so on the wave of popular enthusiasm that accompanied Hitler's rise to power. Contact with the National Socialists was established, and with Hitler's approval, the Transport Ministry agreed to pay 450,000 Reichsmarks annually to Daimler-Benz and Auto Union to develop Grand Prix designs. This sum was less than a quarter of what Daimler-Benz chairman Wilhelm Kissel considered necessary, and about a tenth of what they were actually going to spend. But it was an important encouragement. The new Mercedes was designed under the direction of Hans Niebel, Director of Central Design. Max Wagner designed the chassis, Albert Hies and Otto Schilling the engine. Powered by a 3.3-litre supercharged straight-8 engine, the W25 featured indirect transmission mounted in unit with the rear axle gears. The M25 engine was carefully developed and produced over 300 brake horsepower, running on a special cocktail of methyl alcohol, nitrobenzene, acetone and ether. The Auto Union was an even more revolutionary design. The P-Wagen had the engine mounted behind the driver in what is now called a mid-engine position. This is the normal layout of a Grand Prix car, but in 1933-34, the new idea was taken to the extreme. The engine was a single overhead cam, V16, 4.5-litre. The V16 was a very long engine and the driver sat a long way in front of it. The rear wheels were driven by a 5-speed gearbox with swing axle suspension. the Nazi government decided to closely supervise the German Grand Prix effort and set up the National Socialist Motoring Corps, headed by one of Hitler's cronies, Obergruppenführer Hühnlein. This organization was to become the ultimate authority of motoring events inside Germany. The drivers for the Mercedes team in 1934 were Rudi Caracciola, Italian ace Luigi Fagioli, and Manfred von Brautich. Hans Stuck was the star for Auto Union. In the German Grand Prix, the Mercedes experienced teething troubles, leaving Fagioli to finish second, while Stuck won for Auto Union. The German teams arrived at Montelleri for the French Grand Prix in a blaze of publicity. The impressive Teutonic organization should have struck fear into the Alfa Romeo and Bugatti opposition, as Alfred Neubauer, having made the transition from driver to team manager for Mercedes, marshalled his troops. Unfortunately, Louis Chiron, the very talented Monegasque driver, had not read the script, and although the German cars led the race, they all retired, leaving Chiron to win the race for Alfa Romeo. The German teams quietly packed up and returned home, determined to avoid this embarrassing experience. Further development was carried out on the Mercedes engine, and it was now developing over 350 brake horsepower. Luigi Fagioli went on to record 3 victories for Mercedes in the Coppa Acerba at Pescara and the Italian and Spanish Grand Prix. In 1935, the Mercedes were driven by Caracciola, von Brautich, Fagioli, and occasionally new recruits Hermann Lang and Hans Geier. Hermann Lang had joined Daimler-Benz as a mechanic. He was a keen motorcycle racer and eventually badgered Neubauer into giving him a trial drive for the racing team. Lang was destined to become one of the greats. Auto Union had signed up the great Italian Achille Varzi and the young motorcycle star Bernd Rosemeyer. His career was to burn brightly, but only for a short time. The season began with Fagioli winning the most grueling race for the drivers, the Monaco Grand Prix. Rudi Caracciola won the Tripoli Grand Prix with Fagioli third. The following month, Fagioli and Caracciola won the Arvus and Eiffel races respectively. Then came the greatest triumph of the year, the French Grand Prix. The previous year had been a disaster, but 1935 was very different. Caracciola first, von Brautich second, Fagioli fourth. Fagioli won at Barcelona with Caracciola second, who then went on to win the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. The German Grand Prix caused more than its fair share of excitement. Caracciola led from Fagioli, with Nuvellari's Alfa Romeo close behind. Then Bernd Rosemeyer came through to take second place, pressing Caracciola hard. Rosemeyer lost time, having a faulty wheel changed, and eventually suffered from engine trouble. Just as von Brautich looked certain to win, he suffered a burst tyre on the last lap, letting Tazio Nuvellari win the Grosse Prix von Deutschland for Alfa Romeo. Stuck's Auto Union was second, Caracciola third, and Rosemeyer fourth in a classic race. Caracciola won the Swiss Grand Prix at Bern with Fagioli second, while Hermann Lang made his Mercedes debut and finished sixth. Caracciola was again the winner in the Spanish Grand Prix, with Fagioli and von Brautich close behind. This brought the season to a very successful close for Mercedes, with Caracciola a worthy European champion. A new V12 engine called the D-Series had been on the stock since 1934 and was to replace the current 8-cylinder inline engine. The drivers for Mercedes were again led by Rudi Caracciola, whose greatest fan was team manager Neubauer, the relationship between them becoming almost one of father and son. Over the years, this was to cause all sorts of difficulties within the team. With its lineup of determined drivers such as Lang, von Brautich, Fagioli and Richard Seaman, all were capable of being as fast as Caracciolo, and they would have to disregard Neubauer's orchestration of the event if they wanted to win, which was not to be recommended. Neubauer's real gift was the tactical planning of a Grand Prix. As they were run over a distance of several hundred kilometres, the cars had to make planned stops to refuel and change tyres. The correct timing of these stops often decided the race. Auto Union again relied on Stuck, Varzi and the new star Bernd Rosemeyer. Mercedes started off the year with the new, shorter wheelbase version of the W25, now with a 4.9-litre engine producing well over 400 brake horsepower. It couldn't compare with its predecessor, having inferior road holding, steering and power transmission. In a race run in terrible wet conditions, the early part of the race was a tremendous battle between Caracciolo's Mercedes and Nuvolari's Alfa Romeo. This was motor racing at its best, with two of the greatest wet-weather drivers battling for supremacy. Eventually, Nuvolari dropped back with problems, leaving Caracciolo to win the race. June was an unsuccessful month for Mercedes. They were well beaten in the Barcelona Grand Prix, while in the Eiffelrennen, Bernd Rosemeyer in the Auto Union proved that he had come of age by taking the lead in the later stages of the race in a typically thick Eiffel mist. He won the race, leaving the Mercedes team in his wake. Rosemeyer went on to totally dominate the season for Auto Union, winning the German, Spanish and Swiss Grand Prix, as well as minor events at the Nürburgring and the Coppa Acerba at Pescara. It was a wonderful season for Auto Union, the Type C having been mastered by a driver for the first time. Rosemeyer was almost unbeatable, his fighting spirit and audacious driving triumphing over the establishment. There is no doubt that 1936 was a defeat of the first magnitude for Mercedes. The cars from Stuttgart were withdrawn from 4 races as they were uncompetitive. It was their lowest point since the failure of the Grand Prix 8 in 1924. After a run of disasters, the organisation made a number of rapid and far-reaching changes. Between Alfred Neubauer's sporting department and the engineers in the central design office, a new department was formed, the racing department. The young man who now appeared on the scene marked a turning point in the history of motor racing. His name, Rudolf Uhlenhuth. He was educated in England and was able to drive as fast as the current drivers. He reported directly to Fritz Nallinger, who headed the experimental department and was assigned the services of Jakob Kraus in charge of car construction and George Shearer as head of testing. While the actual engineering work would be carried out by the central design office under Wagner and Hies, Uhlenhuth's new group would be responsible for assembling, preparing and testing the cars. The result of all this activity was the development of the Mercedes W125 with its 5.6-litre 8-cylinder engine, which was capable of developing 646 brake horsepower, one of the most spectacular racing cars ever built. English driver Dick Seaman had already made a name for himself with his cool handling of MG, ERA and Delage cars. Lang was promoted to a full-time drive, and the third was Christian Kautz, a wealthy young Swiss. Seaman crashed a 1936 car in practice, but found to his surprise that his chief considered racing cars expendable, in moderation, as long as the driver was not badly hurt. In addition, Neubauer explained to him exactly what he had done wrong. During the season, Rudolf Uhlenhuth was usually in attendance at races. He was not only an engineer of great distinction, but a driver of Grand Prix standard. After lapping faster than the 1936 drivers, he received a severe dressing down and had orders not to consider himself expendable. The new W125 appeared for the first time at the Tripoli Grand Prix, where most of the corners could be taken at speed in excess of 240 kilometers an hour. It called for the car to be placed with considerable skill. The 1937 Auto Union had a bigger 6-litre engine and, driven by Rosemeyer, was going to be a force to be reckoned with. In Tripoli, Neubauer insisted that his drivers looked after their tyres, and as a result of this, Hermann Lang won his first major victory for Mercedes. In the annual race at the Avus, it was a straight battle between the streamlined Mercedes of Lang and the Auto Unions. Caracciolo won the first heat and Lang the second. Hermann Lang won the final, driving superbly. This 160-kilometre race was around a circuit with banked U-turns at each end. They were joined by 2 straights. Lang's average speed was 260 kilometres an hour, and it showed that he must have been travelling at over 300 kilometres an hour on the straights. A fortnight later, the Eiffel race was won for the 3rd year in a row by Bernd Rosemeyer. Both teams sent cars to the Vanderbilt Cup in the USA. Seaman thought he was in with a chance until he was shown how it was done by Bernd Rosemeyer, to the detriment of his standing within the team. Whilst the stars were in America, Rudolf Hasse won the Belgian Grand Prix for Auto Union. Caracciolo won the German Grand Prix again after Rosemeyer had a tyre lose its tread. It took 2.5 minutes to replace the tyre and hub, effectively ending his challenge. At Monaco, Caracciolo and von Brautich had a glorious scrap. At one point, Neubauer became concerned and tried to flag down von Brautich. The mercurial Prussian, who was the only driver to ever disobey Neubauer and get away with it, won the race. In the Coppa Acerba, Rosemeyer hit a post and bent a rear wheel, but still won. Caracciolo then won the Swiss Grand Prix at Bern and the Italian Grand Prix at Livorno, which gave him enough points to win the 1937 European Championship. It was a personal triumph for Fred Craner, the clerk of the course at Donington, to persuade both Auto Union and Mercedes to enter for the British Grand Prix. The enthusiastic British crowd were rewarded with a tremendous race. Lang led for Mercedes at the start. Seaman soon had to retire with damaged shock absorbers, joined by Lang with the same problem. This left the race as a straight fight between von Brautich and Rosemeyer. Rosemeyer was leading when von Brautich replaced a tyre. Rosemeyer's victory was very popular with the British crowd. This spectacular event was an eye-opener for British racing enthusiasts who'd expected a British driver to win in a British car. Before the 1938 season even started, motor racing suffered a sad loss when on January the 28th, Bernd Rosemeyer was killed. It was during a speed record attempt on the Frankfurt-Darmstadt Autobahn. His Auto Union was hit by a gust of wind while travelling at over 400 kilometres an hour. Germany's hero of the people was killed instantly. For the new season, there was a new Grand Prix formula, which stipulated 3 litres for supercharged cars and 4.5 litres unsupercharged. The new Mercedes W154 was based on the previous model, with a new low-slung chassis and an all-new engine. They departed from the 8-cylinder configuration and settled on a V12, which developed 468 brake horsepower. Auto Union introduced the new D-Type, for which director Werner, chief engineer Siebler, and engineers Jakob von Oberhorst and Strubel were responsible. This was also a 3-litre supercharged V12, which developed 420 brake horsepower. It was still mid-engined, but the driver was placed further back, which made the car more controllable. Ferdinand Porsche had by this time left Auto Union to design and build the people's car, the Volkswagen. In spite of their lack of power, the 4.5-litre De La Haye of French driver René Dreyfus won the first race for the new formula at Pau. He didn't have to make a refueling stop, while the Mercedes opposition did. During practice for the Pau race, Tazio Nuvolari ended his long association with Alfa Romeo after his car suffered a broken fuel line and burst into flames. He vowed never to race in Alfa again, and later in the season drove for Auto Union. The Auto Union team were in trouble after the death of Rosemeyer. He had been Mercedes' rival on the track and a great friend of the team away from it, with the exception of Caracciola. And he was missed by the Mercedes team as much as by his teammates Müller, Hasse and Kautz. The first major race of the season was the Tripoli Grand Prix. The Italian organisers would only accept 3 entries from Mercedes: Caracciola, Lang and von Brautic. The Auto Union team wasn't ready. Hermann Lang led throughout and the new car ran like clockwork. He won his second Tripoli Grand Prix from von Brautic and Caracciola. For the French Grand Prix at Reims, Auto Union entered 2 cars for Hasse and Kautz. Müller was injured. France was represented by a number of lost causes. Delahaye's, Talbot's, Bugatti's were too slow, and a CFAC which was quite fast for a short time. In the race, both Auto Unions crashed on the first lap, while the Bugatti retired, followed next lap by the CFAC. The Talbots continued, but were lapped by the Mercedes. Manfred von Brautic drove a fine race to take the lead after Lang's pit stop, when the car wouldn't start for 4 minutes. Mercedes put on a fine show and proved their superiority, von Brautic winning from Caracciola and Lang. The Auto Union team were determined that the German Grand Prix would not be another walkover for Mercedes, and brought Nuvolari into the team. He initially had some difficulty coming to terms with the Auto Union. He didn't quite develop Rosemeyer's touch, but he was the only driver to really master this car. Indeed, he was the only real opposition for the Mercedes team. The ever-efficient Germans had developed a system of lights to start the Grand Prix, but unfortunately they failed, and the start was chaotic. Lang went into the lead, only to make a mistake and slide off. This left von Brautic in the lead from Seaman, with a sick Caracciola third, before he handed his car over to Hermann Lang. Von Brautic was leading when he came in for his second stop. The big tank in the tail was filled by 75mm pipes from the saddle tanks. In spite of inspection windows, it was very difficult to judge the right moment to cut off the pressure-fed fuel, coming down at 25 litres a second. Some fuel was spilt, and when the car was restarted, it caught fire. Von Brautic wrenched off the steering wheel and was pulled clear by Alfred Neubauer, who simultaneously put the well-practiced fire drill into effect. As the fire was put out, he ordered Richard Seaman to return to the race as his car was also in the pits. Within a short time the fire was out and von Brautic was back in the race, but he had not pushed the steering wheel on far enough, and it came off at over 200 kilometers an hour and he crashed. He walked back to the pits with the steering wheel in his hand, but the car was wrecked. Seaman, meanwhile, was driving superbly and came home to win the German Grand Prix. It was a popular victory for the crowd who enjoyed the Englishman's driving. Lang was second in Caracciola's car, Hans Stuck was third, and Nuvolari fourth for Auto Union in Müller's car. Richard Seaman continued his good form in the Swiss Grand Prix at Bern. The race was held in rainy conditions, and he took the lead from the start, but was overtaken by the rainmaster Caracciola, who never put a foot wrong and went on to win. The Italian Grand Prix was held at Monza on the combined road and banked track. Sooner or later, the run of Mercedes' success was bound to come to an end. Nuvolari had, at last, found his form in the Auto Union. Von Brautic, Lang and Seaman all retired with serious engine trouble. This left Caracciola's Mercedes running so hot that the pedals were burning the soles of his shoes. He took it in turns to drive this object of torture with von Brautich because he had to finish the race in order to win the European Championship for the third time. Just before the end of the race, Stuck and Muller's engines blew up, leaving Nuvolari's Auto Union to win from Farina's Alfa, with the barbecued Caracciola finishing third for Mercedes. Mercedes and Auto Union both entered full teams for the second British Grand Prix at Donington Park. This race saw Nuvolari at the top of his form. Given the right car, there was no one quite like him. Caracciola wasn't able to race due to his burned feet. Nuvolari appeared to throw all caution to the wind, and it was Nuvolari's day, although victory did not come easily. He was in front from the start, but pitted to change a plug. This dropped him to fourth. At this point, Hansen's Alto deposited all of its oil on the Craner curves. Nuvolari coped with this in his usual masterly fashion. Von Brautich spun and only just managed to regain control. Hasse ran off the road and crashed. Seaman also ended up off the course but managed to get started again. As a result, Muller's Auto Union was leading ahead of Lang and Nuvolari. Nuvolari now drove as only he could and caught up with Lang, who was slowed by a broken windscreen. Nuvolari retook the lead and romped away to victory with Lang second and a magnificent drive by Seaman to recover third place. Hill climb specialist Hans Stuck was first in the Grossglockner Pass hill climb in Austria in 1938, with Lang second and von Brautich third. The 1938 season had been a fine one for Mercedes, with another European Championship for Caracciola. Auto Union had clawed their way back to competitiveness late in the season, inspired by Nuvolari. In 1939 there were few serious changes. Mercedes saw little reason for radical change to their successful W154, but did decide to give it an improved engine. This was the Type M163, a twin supercharged V12 which developed 485 brake horsepower. Daimler-Benz engineers had experimented with direct fuel injection, though this would not appear in serious competition until the 1950s. Auto Union had carried out a thorough winter development program on their D-Type V12, which was now also using twin superchargers, which resulted in their obtaining the same power as Mercedes. The last pre-war season did provide one major surprise. The Italians, somewhat miffed at being beaten on a regular basis by the German teams, decided to restrict their national events to the Voiturette regulations, which limited engine size to 1.5 litres. Organisers of the Tripoli Grand Prix had unexpectedly switched to this from the Grand Prix regulations, hoping no doubt for an Italian victory by Alfa Romeo or Maserati. The moment the Mercedes team heard about this, they decided to build a new V8 Voiturette from scratch. They achieved this minor miracle in just 6 months. The chassis was a scaled-down version of the 1939 W163. The engine, however, was entirely new, a double-overhead cam V8 with single-stage supercharging, which developed 254 brake horsepower against the Alfa Romeo 158's 225 and the Maserati 4CL's 220. Neither of the Italian cars had the same performance as the Mercedes. The appearance of the Mercedes at Tripoli caused a sensation. Hermann Lang took first place for the third successive year. Caracciola was second, with an Alfa Romeo third and a Maserati fourth. The W165 Mercedes didn't race again after its Tripoli victory, although Mercedes developed two-stage supercharging for it. In 1951, Mercedes did revive it for Grand Prix racing in the formula of the time. But when they discovered that the formula for 1952 was for 2-litre unsupercharged cars, they decided against developing the car any further. It was then returned to the museum in Stuttgart, where it can be seen today. Lang also won the Eifelrennen from Nuvolari's Auto Union, which was driven right through the race on the same set of tyres. Carrocceria and von Brautic were third and fourth for Mercedes. It was beginning to look as if 1939 was going to be Hermann Lang's year. 3 races and 3 victories. Lang was generally considered to be a better driver than Hans Stuck, but there were very few drivers who could compare with Stuck in the specialist sport of speed hill climbing. Lang was very keen to challenge him, at least on the Vienna climb, the Hohenstrassen. 2 special Mercedes were prepared, one with a 5.6-litre engine and one with a highly supercharged 3-litre. Auto Union bought a special 3-litre car and one of the old 6-litre cars. Everything didn't go quite according to the Mercedes plan, as both Lang and von Brautic blew up their engines in practice. They took their places the next day, however, as well prepared as ever. Each driver had to make 2 climbs, the winner having the lowest aggregate time. On the first runs, Müller set the fastest time for Auto Union, followed by Hermann Lang and von Brautic. Stuck, surprisingly, was 4th, almost 2 seconds down to von Brautic. On the second climb, Müller lost time to Lang, who beat him by half a second. Von Brautic could not quite catch Müller, who took second place by 0.2 of a second. Either Stuck or the car must have been badly off form, as his times for once did not compare with the other 3 drivers, and it was a 4th win for Hermann Lang. A fortnight later, the Belgian Grand Prix was held on the ultra-fast Spa-Francorchamps course. Could Lang win again? The race was run in wet and very slippery conditions with very bad visibility. In spite of the weather, Richard Seaman thought that he had the feel of the circuit and started to go very quickly in the conditions. Carrocceria, who was normally a master in the rain, slid off at La Source and was unable to continue. Nuvolari also went off, while Seaman, still going very quickly, passed Lang and went into the lead. By the 21st lap, after the pit stops, he was leading by 30 seconds. Then he came into La Source, was badly placed for it, and crashed into the trees. Seaman was knocked unconscious and was unable to remove the steering wheel and get out of the car when the fuel, which was escaping from a ruptured pipe, burst into flames. Seaman was badly burned before he could be removed from the car by an heroic Belgian gendarme and the Auto Union driver Meyer, who had retired from the race. Seaman suffered severe burns, from which he died a few hours later. Lang was dreadfully upset and wanted to retire, but was ordered to continue, going on to record his 5th victory of the season in very sad circumstances. The Auto Union team was now beginning to get their act together, and Nuvolari was mastering the difficult rear-engined cars. Uhlenhoyt and assistants worked hard preparing the Mercedes for the German Grand Prix at Nürburgring. Lang beat Rosemeyer's lap record, which showed that the W163 might not develop the same power as the W125, but its better road holding enabled it to lap quicker. Lang made one of his terrific starts, while Carrocceria was saving his tyres and playing a waiting game. There was a sensation when Maserati driver Paul Pietsch took his car up into second place. Then, when Lang came into the pits and retired, Pietsch was in the lead. This left 2 Mercedes in the race, Carrocceria and Newman Brendel. He was signalled to come in and hand his car over to Lang, but didn't see the signal, and then compounded the error, getting into a muddle when trying to pass Pietsch. Neubauer had rarely been more furious, as there was now only 1 Mercedes left. Fortunately, it was driven by the old master, Carrocceria, who speeded up when it started to rain, and won the German Grand Prix again for the 6th time. Müller was 2nd for Auto Union, and Pietsch 3rd for Maserati. At the Grossglockner hill climb, Hermann Lang made the climb of his life, scoring fastest time of the day and beating Stuck's record of the previous year. Lang won the coveted title of Bergmeister as well as European champion. The Swiss Grand Prix of Bern was a fast and exciting race, which ended as a good many races did in 1939, with a Mercedes-Benz 1-2-3, Lang, Carrocceria and von Brautic, with Müller and Nuvolari 4th and 5th for Auto Union. The Yugoslavs wanted to have a Grand Prix. The only place it could be held was around the streets of Belgrade. Mercedes were represented by Lang, Van Brautic and Baumer. Lang led the race for a while until his engine blew up and Van Brautic spun, avoiding teammate Baumer. Through all this, Nuvolari's Auto Union won, with Van Brautic second. So the record books will show that Tazio Nuvolari's Auto Union won the last Grand Prix before the outbreak of World War II. Post-war, Mercedes returned to racing as their industrial strength grew. Pre-war figures like Neubauer and Uhlenhuth were at the forefront of the team's success from 1952 to 1955. Mercedes won the 1952 Le Mans 24-hour race with Hermann Lang leading the team. The win was greeted with muted applause. Grand Prix success in 1954 and 55 was tempered by the tragedy at Le Mans when Pierre Levesque crashed, killing more than 80 people. Mercedes retired from the sport at the end of 1955. They returned in the 1980s via sports car racing and are now a major shareholder in Formula One team McLaren. World Championships with Mika Hakkinen in 1998 and 99 are the high points of the modern era. Auto Union was based at Zwickau in what became East Germany after World War II. The racing cars disappeared into obscurity and the name Auto Union faded away. The company was renamed Audi and retained the four-ring badge, and Audi popularised four-wheel drive for road cars with the awesome Audi Quattros of the 1980s. Here, at the oldest motor racing venue in the world, Chelles-le-Roche, rally star Hannu Mikkola puts the turbo-powered car through its paces. John Surtees demonstrated one of the very rare Auto Union racing cars. Audi is now part of the Volkswagen Group and competes today in sports car racing. To date, they've won 3 Le Mans 24-hour races in a row, continuing their involvement in racing. The Silver Arrows may not dominate the racing world as they did in the remarkable era of the 1930s, but the standards they set paved the way for the professionalism of today's racing. It also showed the dangers of unchecked nationalism and the stain on the history of Mercedes and Auto Union.